the leading thinkers to reflect critically on AU's African Union, in this case, peace and security architecture, institutional limitations, and of course the broader geopolitical and economic forces, both internally and externally, of course, that shape peace outcomes. And our aim really out of this series is to have this interest thinking around how the AU can adapt its frameworks and partnership to meet the demands of today's crisis. And so this discussion really, it's the beginning of a broader peace and security dialogue series where we want to build on the insights that we share today to deepen, of course, policy conversations, as well as explore more targeted solutions across the continent. So we're going to hear from three distinguished speakers, and from then on, we're going to be followed by a Q&A where we're going to invite active participation. And I think people will be able to use the chat function as well as raise their hands during the Q&A segment. And each speaker will have about 20 minutes each. So our first speaker is Dr. John Murray, who will speak on the evolution of the AU peace and security, norms and structures, and is going to take us through the foundations of APSA, including the role and mediation mandate. Dr. John Murray is a researcher in the School of Management, Governance, and Public Policy at the CBE, that's called College of Business and Economics at the University of UJ, as well as a South African member of the South African Association of Political Studies. And before joining UJ, he has served as different capacities, including teaching and learning, as well as in Afro-centric governance of public affairs, research entity at the Northwest University here in South Africa. And is also a visiting scholar in international relations and diplomacy at the University of the Gambia. And his research interests includes peace and security, international relations, as well as political history and environmental studies in South Africa. Without further ado, Dr. John Murray, can welcome Dr. John Murray to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Special thanks to the chair, the organizers of this program, all protocols duly observed. I will be talking on two topics: the evolution of the AU peace and security architecture, looking at the norms and structures. Then secondly, I'll look at the overview of AU peace and security frameworks, the role of APSA, and mediation mandates. First, the evolution of AU peace and security architecture cannot be traced when we say evolution without going back to the historical origin. And the historical origin is rooted on the AAU. The journey to AU started through the formation of Organization of African Unity that was established in 1963. The simple aim of that organization then was to promote African unity, solidarity, and cooperation. However, over the years, the organization continued to evolve from one level to another. In 1991, there was the Abuja Treaty that advocated for African Economic Community, which laid the foundation for the ideology of continental economic integration. While that was being discussed in the OAU, Mama Gaddafi and his team came up with an arrangement for the seats declaration that was signed in 1999, where the call for the AU establishment took center piece. In the year 2000, there was the Lome Summit. In that Lome Summit, the Constitutive Act of the African Union was adopted. And by 2002, African Union became a real child that was born into the governmental politics of Africa. The objectives of the African Union. One is to promote African unity and solidarity. Two, to defend African sovereignty and territorial integrity, especially in this era when the likes of Russia will get up and invade Ukraine. So that aim is still very relevant. Three, promoting economic integration, because it is a world characterized by trade wars, as we currently experience with the recent political position of President Trump, sorry. Then the fourth is significant in our discussion: promotion of peace and security. It is upon this fourth objective that the idea of African peace and security architecture evolved from. The African peace and security architecture here simply focuses on how to manage the roots of conflict and insecurity in Africa in order to create an environment for sustainable peace and societal development, as well as good governance. It also centers on the promotion of the culture of collective security among the African states, society, and people. What are the norms? When you talk about norms, you are looking at both the ethical issues of expected standards of behavior. Now, when you talk of APSA norms, you are looking at what are we expecting these institutions to do in relation to attaining peace and security in Africa. These expectations and standards of behavior could be on social norms. For instance, let me be more practical. It is expected that if AU sends peacekeeping mission in Congo, in Sudan, in any other country, the soldiers should go there and ethically deliver on their professional activities. But like I've written elsewhere, you hear stories of soldiers raping ladies and things like that. You hear stories of the marriages of these soldiers clashing, especially if they're on foreign mission. And then the question is, why did these expected professionals lose the anointing to hold body and soul together? Look for the answer and think of the answer. That is one of your assignments in this webinar. There is also the cultural norms. Here, these professionals are expected not to touch the roots of tradition, culture, and civilization of the people. Unfortunately, again, in these cases of professional peacekeeping, these foreigners do not know what constitutes a given cultural heritage. And in a number of cases, songs of sacrilege and abuse of culture is heard. Then you have the institutional norms, which is the one they do excellently well or near perfectly well. This one has to do with professional guidelines in peacekeeping. They are institutional. It has to do with laws of international engagement. It has to do with issues of territorial integrity and sovereignty, etc. In all, APSA norms promotes the best and the highest international standard of norms and value in terms of human culture and behavior. But you know that the only place where you have people who deliver standard and perfect human behavior is on the graveyard. Key structures. What are the key structures you have? You have the Peace and Security Council of APSA. The Peace and Security Council of APSA is the decision-making body of APSA. Anytime there is sustainable evidence on threat to peace and security in the continent, this body must look at it, they must evaluate it, and take a position. You have the Continental Early Warning System. These people look at potential conflict information and possibly bring it to the record of AU and affected countries that they share it with. They also propose strategies for early warning that could lead to sustainable peace. Unfortunately, if wishes were horses, this structure would naturally abort all conflict and insecurity in the African continent. But in the world of politics and human behavior and state governance, all things can never be equal. It is only in economics, that such ideas like ceteris paribus succeed. There is also the third structure, the African Standby Force. This is a small force that responds to conflict. Unfortunately, the scope or the geospatial nature of African continent and the scope of insecurity, threats of war, terrorism, civil war, military coups, name them, are so unlimited in the continent that this small group cannot deliver on their targeted promise. Then the panel of the wise and the high commissioners. These are people that gives advice and guidance on the best paths that AU should follow in their quest to attain APSA. If they must reach the manifest destiny of APSA, the advice of these professionals needs to be sought. It is at this place I will stop the first lecture because looking at roles, I will be looking at roles and mediation in the second topic. I don't know if I am to go into the second topic or if we are taking questions before the second topic. Moderator, please guide me properly.
Thank you for the first part, Doc. I think because of time, I would essentially want to introduce our second speaker. At the end of the presentation, we will be able to ask questions on the topic.
So I should go ahead with the second presentation.
Yeah, yes, please. And you have about 5 minutes left. Thank you.
In the second one, we look at ABSA frameworks. One, there is the promotion of comprehensive peace. Unfortunately, I argue that they often go for reactive peace when there is already conflict. There is the framework for Peace and Security Council that outlines mandate and principles. There is Agenda 2063 that promotes African strategy for development across sovereign states that is destroyed by corruption, ethnic politics, etc. There is the joint UN-AU framework for enhanced partnership in peace and security. Their work is to go into joint peace and security management. Unfortunately, the interest of the UN funders decides the conflict they will go into joint funding and the ones they will not go into joint funding. The AU Continental Framework for Youth, Peace and Security, where youths have to come in because it is believed that youths are major actors in the conflict. Then the African Peer Review Mechanism for Good Governance and Security Governance. Similarly, the roles of ABSA will include conflict prevention, conflict management, peace building 3, regional cooperation 4, and Afrocentrism. That is African ownership of their structures of peace and security and not foreign ownership, mediation efforts. Collaboration with regional economic communities. 2, you have regional economic communities. You also have regional mechanisms for peace. 2, engaging with civil society, both the governmental and non-governmental. That is the basis of engaging with the UN. And UN Resolution 2719 of the Security Council allows for UN funding of joint AU African peace. Then you have the AU Mediation and Dialogue Division. What are the benefits of this mediation? Improve peace and security, increase regional cooperation, increased African ownership, and how have they done specific mediation? In the Ethiopian conflict between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray Republic, Tigray People's Liberation Movement, former President Olusegun Obasanjo, who is AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa, was sent to do shuttle diplomacy there. Unfortunately, the challenge of trust was fundamental because the TPLF complained that Obasanjo and Ahmed, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, were close friends. The ABSA has been involved in negotiating peace, both in UNAMID, African Union Hybrid Operation in Darfur, African Union Mission in Somalia, African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, etc. Today, the top in discussion is military intervention in governance, resource costs and civil war, and finally terrorism. These are fundamental issues of security and insecurity that aborts the peace of the African nation. Thank you, and God bless you for listening.
All right, thank you so much, Doc. Thank you for that overview of institutional foundations and that shape how the African Union responds. I think one key issue of interest is how these AU frameworks are well adapted to responding to new threats, hybrid warfare, non-state actors, as well as in light of recurring military coups. Are these normative frameworks proving effective or becoming obsolete? Uh, but of course, in this discussion next, we're going to have Dr. Weston Shilao, who's going to explore building on the AU mediation capacity gaps and opportunities in addressing the conflicts that the continent finds itself in. So Dr. Shilao is a scholar in international relations at the University of Witwatersrand, and his research, of course, it engages critical issues in African politics, and his work focuses on the International Criminal Court, responsibility to protect democratic institutions, state building, conflict resolution, transitional justice, and of course the evolving BRICS Africa partnership. And he's an author of and a single author authored book called Politics, Power, and Tribalism in Kenya, which offers deep insights into identity politics and governance issues on the continent. Through his work, Dr. Shilao continues to illuminate the intersections of justice, peace, and development in Africa in the pursuit of democratic and sustainable democratic futures. Dr. Shilao, welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chair. Greetings to all the participants. Chair, I'm going to talk about the AU mediation with a bias towards the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. These are some of the trouble spots on the continent, the Sahel region and the Horn of Africa. And of course, the political instability in the Sahel is topical, both within Africa and beyond, because of military coups, which have got their roots in a whole host of things, not limited to colonial legacies. So it's a semi-arid region south of the Sahara. And of course, that harsh climatic condition has a bearing on that region. The Horn of Africa, usually that part of the continent that is in close proximity to the Red Sea. I use the word close proximity because Ethiopia has no access to the sea. It has this dubious distinction as one of the biggest countries in the world without access to the sea. And then, of course, there's Eritrea there, which gained independence in 1993, Djibouti, and Somalia. Largely, those countries constitute what is referred to as the Horn of Africa. Again, a region soaked in conflict, ethnic tensions, and a whole of political upheavals dating back decades ago and still persisting as we speak. And that comes with a whole host of challenges, security threats, armed conflicts, and of course, political instability. Reasons as to why these regions are, caught up in persistent political instability vary, but largely you can attribute some of the causes to colonial legacies, as I've said. The post-colonial state in Africa is still pretty much a replica of the colonial state, very repressive, very extractive, very predatory, and therefore weak and incapable of fulfilling its core mandates, uppermost being addressing the pressing needs of the people, not just of these regions, but of the continent at large. So how has AU performed as far as mediation is concerned? Ideally, we would like conflict not to arise. And if they arise, that mechanisms would be put in place to forestall de-escalation into violence, political instability, loss of lives, and in worst case scenarios, laying these countries to waste as failed states. So AU affirms the imperative to arrest conflicts before they degenerate into an unmitigated disaster. And that's why the AU Constitutive Act and Peace and Security Council protocol emphasize peaceful resolution of conflicts on the continent. And it has come up with a whole host of other interventions, as it was mentioned by the previous speaker, the panel of the wise, the early warning system, the AU mediation support unit, not to provide the technical and operational support to these efforts. And therefore, mediation is a concerted kind of process. It's concentric in the sense that it spans national, regional, and local domains. And it's a technical process. It's not just about making protagonists sit at table and ask them to shake hands. It's fairly much more nuanced and complicated than that. So the AU has the mandate to promote peace and mediate conflicts in Africa. Because without peace in Africa, then the whole notion about development and prosperity and Agenda 2063 will not be realized. For you can't harness people's talents and efforts to better their living standards in an atmosphere of political instability. So in these regions, particularly in the Sahel and Horn, we've got, Mali, for instance, it's had civil conflict, and the terrorist kind of insurgency in Burkina Faso, in Niger. And that's one of the reasons as to why these countries have experienced military coups in the recent past, in the sense that the military juntas in these countries believed that the civilian regimes were too weak to stabilize these countries. And there was something of puppet regimes that did not respond to the needs and aspirations of the people in this region. And therefore, they are to be run out of power. And that violence has had a transnational effect, spillover violence across the region. It's the same thing in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia, ironically, the seat of the African Union, has been something of a theater of political instability and turmoil for quite some time. Recently being the violence in the northern part of that country, pitting the regime in Addis Ababa against the Tigray region. Of course, following the death of its very strong and developmental leader, Meles Zenawi. So recently, Ethiopia have had an ongoing conflict for a while. Djibouti, something of, it's got some semblance of stability, but it's because there's a strong man in power, and it's geopolitically strategic, being the only country in Africa hosting a whole host of military bases in that part of the continent, because of security interests from the West, from China, and a whole host of countries. So it's a volatile region, full of tensions, and that it's ever moving very fast. What are the issues? Well, in the Horn of Africa, for instance, Somalia has had no political stability since 91. In 2018, we thought, the Ethiopia-Eritrea border conflict had been resolved, but there has been, something of, civil war in Ethiopia, and Eritrea was implicated. There's tensions in Sudan. There's an unfolding humanitarian crisis in Sudan as we speak now. Tensions in South Sudan. One of the vice presidents is under house arrest. A country that has not had elections since it broke away from Sudan in 2011. Well, of course, the two countries are not defined specifically as being part of the Horn of Africa, but they are regionally relevant, and their politics is also relevant within the entire region, part of the IGAD, the regional intergovernmental body. They fall under that umbrella. Ethnic tensions have taken center stage, and of course, politics has been divided along that axis, and the fighting tends to take that trajectory. And of course, the external influences, and of course, regional considerations, and therefore the mediation efforts in these regions usually come up against trust issues. The previous speaker talked about Obasanjo's lack of moral gravitas, being not considered to be impartial enough to mediate in Ethiopia. What is the role of the African Union? We're going to promote dialogue and reconciliation, not to take sides where conflicts arise, but often sometimes they get caught up in the midst of these conflicts, and which necessitates the intervention of external actors. And it's an indictment of African solutions to African problems and our capacity and ability to resolve our own challenges and devise our homegrown systems and mechanisms to resolve our conflicts without relying on external actors, to deploy peacekeeping mission in all sorts of places. But of course, there's the capacity in terms of financing. Who is going to pick the tab? The AU relies on external funding. So it's always a challenge to deploy these peacekeeping missions and stabilize these places before the violence takes a life of its own, to facilitate peace agreements and reconciliation processes, agreements that will be adhered to by the warring factions and parties. But often they are ignored, they're subverted, and that again goes to the capacity of the AU and of course regional economic communities. Like in Congo, the regional countries are involved in the conflict in the eastern part of the Congo, and they are supposed to be, the ones to take the front line in resolving that conflict because they are within the catchment area. But we saw the other day Tshisekedi and Paul Kagame meeting in Qatar. I mean, I don't know whether that was an indication of the fact that the mediation process by the East African community had come a cropper. To support missions like the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, ATMIS, to keep peace in Somalia and hopefully stabilize that country and rescue it from the West it has been in for decades, since the early 90s. So we've had some kind of a permanent ceasefire of hostilities in northern Ethiopia from 2022, after a horrible humanitarian crisis, which to some met the threshold of genocide against the Tigray people. And Kenya, of course, South Africa, Nigeria, and other international partners have been instrumental in realizing this cessation of hostilities. So AU is very pivotal, but it has also faced criticism, as I said earlier, because of limited capacity, inability to coordinate these complex processes and of course, political challenges, lack of political will. AU, for instance, was very quiet vis-a-vis the Ethiopian crisis. You would imagine that Addis was not the seat of the continental body. Ethiopia reached a peace process. We hope it's going to hold going into the future, but we can see the reverberation of political tensions in the region, with the Ethiopian Prime Minister insisting that Ethiopia must have access to the sea, and that means fighting against Eritrea, because Eritrea has taken all the land that lays claim to it. It was its land historically. It was never part of Ethiopia. So how is Ethiopia going to have a port or access to the sea without fighting against Eritrea? We hope sanity will prevail. Somalia, well, some modicum of a government, central government, but terrorist violence is still pretty much in place. Mediation in South Sudan still going, but as we speak, Riek Machar, one of the vice presidents, is under house arrest. That does not bode well for the country's long-term political stability. In Mali, for instance, if you were to take it as a case study in West Africa, the AU supported the 2015 Agreement for Peace and Reconciliation in Mali. But it seems it didn't hold, because subsequently the military took over. That shows the volatility of the region and how some of these mediation processes and the agreements that are struck at the end of the day hardly find traction. ECOWAS, UN, and other partners have worked in concert in that region to find lasting peace. Peace in Mali and in the Sahel, and other development initiatives to ensure that those countries don't relapse into violence, respond to people's pressing needs, food sovereignty, access to public goods, and reduce, crushing and scandalous poverty, which precipitate some of these challenges and make it difficult to arrest them going forward. Involvement of local communities, so that we don't, latch onto this top-down approach that sometimes the mediation processes employ, where it is thought that if you bring the protagonists at a table and they strike a deal in terms of power sharing or whatever it is, then that in and of itself constitutes the panacea to these problems. It's not true. It can't hold. So what are the opportunities as far as AU mediation is concerned? There's some kind of leadership vacuum, especially in the Sahel, with the withdrawal of Western forces and some kind of a backlash against the French, dominance in the region, the American, interest in the region. That leaves some kind of vacuum that the AU can, fill in and see how it can take forward the peace processes in the region to avoid this disintegration of the Sahel into complete disaster. And that calls for leadership at the AU level and also within the region, the ECOWAS, and it has not come to the party. As we speak, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they are broken away and formed their own regional economic group away from the ECOWAS, because ECOWAS is seen to be doing the bidding of external powers, and therefore they don't trust them to help them find lasting solutions to their problems. So there's need for local mediation to succeed, as I said earlier, community level agreements to involve the communities, because they bear the brunt when peace does not hold, to ensure there's sustainable and lasting peace. And of course, external actors, in as much as we have got issues with them because of their larger than life influence in our affairs in Africa, particularly vis-a-vis the security architecture. The United Nations, the European Union, and other bilateral partners will continue being a constant in these mediation processes and helping Africa, the African Union, to find a lasting peace and, as it were, to accord some of these processes legitimacy. And it's important that regional initiatives are revitalized to relaunch and coordinate processes like a Nouakchott process in the Sahel. And then, of course, capacity. We have to build capacity, as I said. It can't be that it's always Obasanjo all over the place. Where are the other people? Elders on the continent who can be dispatched to these trouble spots. Obasanjo is something of a nonagenarian. He's not going to be here for long. We need to build capacity, investing in training, early warning signs, and mediation support structures, as opposed to just relying on former heads of state and government. What are the constraints? There are constraints, resource constraints, limited funding and logistical support in mediation missions. The AU usually doesn't have the requisite funding to, at the same time, have its foothold and footprint in some of these trouble spots. And that's why some of them go on and assume a life of their own undisturbed, of course, with far-reaching consequences to the people. Overlap of and competition within regional organizations, ECOWAS and IGAD, and other international actors doing pretty much the same thing, and duplication of efforts instead of synergizing. It doesn't help. Political will, lack of political will, inconsistent commitment by member states. Some of the parties, some of the mediators, some of the countries that are expected to mediate are usually complicit in these conflicts. And as I gave the example of Congo, how would you expect the regional, countries to midwife mediation in Congo? And in West Africa, Nigeria, the anchor state, has no legitimacy now to mediate in the Sahel. So political will, expertise and training, as I said, there's need for more skilled mediators. And therefore, for us to sustain this homegrown, mechanisms and measures and systems, we need to invest in our own capacity on the continent. And the AU should lead in that regard. And of course, in concert with the regional economic communities. As I end, AU mediation has achieved significant milestones. Most likely, if AU was not there, the situation on the African continent would be a lot worse than it is, because we don't want even one single life to be lost, but probably to be a lot worse. So they have achieved some significant milestones in either forestalling conflicts from degenerating into full-blown civil wars, or mitigating, disasters. But as it's happening in Sudan, I think there's still work cut out for them. So there are challenges. Challenges remain. Continued regional cooperation is essential for lasting peace. To the extent to which regional communities in Africa cooperate as far as finding lasting peace on the continent, well, the jury's out. But if you can look at, let's say, the Cote d'Ivoire conflict, the OCO has read from a different script, the AU read from a different script. I mean, we don't want to see those kind of things on the continent. Because if you have to act from the principle of subsidiarity, well, you, AU, based in Addis, I think you're going to go by the position of the regional body, because conflicts are, transnational. So the countries within the region, it's assumed we're in a better position to appreciate the conflict and, devise the requisite measures to address it. AU mediation is crucial for peace in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. We cannot overemphasize that well enough. And of course, the capacity issue I mentioned, we have to exploit new opportunities and enhance AU effectiveness as far as regional stability is concerned, not only in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, but across the continent at large. And AU should strive to, as much as possible, move its peace and security architecture from external actors and take charge of it. And it's not going to be easy. I yield, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shilao. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think you touched on a lot of issues that speak in terms of the gaps what the AU currently faces. I think one thing to emphasize also is even when you look at African the solution to African problems, how as a policy in some way is cynical, often misleading, and I think there is a fundamental contradiction between the concept in theory and in practice. And I think also one thing that's important is to contextualize even to the Sahel region is understanding that even if it's the region has a lot of multiple crises, climate change, political instability, but another thing that is equally important also to recognize is that the region is also rich in natural resources, gold, uranium, oil, and I think these issues, of course, they're reflective of the whole political economy of the continent and the challenges thereof. But um, these resources are also often underappreciated in policy discussions because they're equally central to both the drivers of conflict and possibilities for sustainable peace, especially where mediation efforts come into play. Without wasting time, our final speaker will Prof. Garson, who is going to present on the mediation, business interests and conflict in Africa, specifically looking at economic actors and that influence peace outcomes. And this session will essentially want to unpack some of the commercial and geopolitical incentives that intersect with mediation, Sahel region, Africa more broadly. And of course, Prof. Ganson is 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 a leading expert in the socio-political risk mitigation, conflict prevention and resolution, and third-party engagement in post-conflict and complex environment. His interdisciplinary work explores the intersection of private sector development, conflict dynamics, human security, and through his research, writing, and teaching, Prof contributes to a deeper understanding of how business and other stakeholders can navigate and positively influence fragile contexts. So, Prof. Ganson, I think one thing important that I also want to know is perhaps how can the AU respond when powerful private actors are both drivers of conflict and potential peace-building partners in complex environments, and of course, what lessons can be drawn to strengthen conflict prevention, socio-political risk mitigation, and post-conflict recovery. Prof, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So first of all, thank you for the invitation today. And just, I want to perhaps keep my comments a little bit more brief, building on what we've already heard from my colleagues. So let me just make 3 points about how a clearer focus on economic development and on the private sector can perhaps help us make sense of challenges and opportunities for AU mediation and peace building efforts. The first is just to recognize that AU, like most all international efforts, have historically not taken seriously the nature of the economy or the private sector within it as a subject worthy of peace mediation. So very often we see in a review of mediations historically that one of the most important drivers of conflict, who wins and who loses economically, in most cases is not largely addressed in any depth. As the previous speaker said, we see a focus on power sharing and political settlement, but what about the economic settlement? We saw this very clearly, for example, in Sierra Leone at the end of a brutal civil war that was enabled by economic exclusion. The final peace agreement, which ran for pages and pages, chapters and chapters, had 2 paragraphs on the economy, both of them largely abstract and aspirational. And then regional and international partners got very busy rebuilding the economy, but in fact, what happened was in the post-conflict period, we recreated the very economic conditions that gave rise to the war in the first place. And today, all the evidence shows that the private sector is an important vector for persistent fragility and even risk of another state collapse in Sierra Leone. And I think that helps us to understand the breakdown, the constant reaching of agreement and breakdown of agreement in places like Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, where we don't really have an agreement because one of the most critical issues has not been addressed. And this might lead us to ask whether there's a gap in the AU peace and mediation architecture with respect to the voices and perspectives needed to name and address issues of peaceful and inclusive economic development, including the kind of private sector we want and need in these places. The second point I would make, also building from prior comments, is in our mediations, I'd argue that we largely failed to take into account the degree to which African economies are limited access economic orders. That's the technical language, meaning that a small elite controls both the levers of political power and the levers of economic power. And what this means is that the political actors at the table, who may be espousing certain values or certain principles or certain preferred outcomes, are at the same time being driven by the parochial economic interests of their own close circle. We see that in Sudan and South Sudan. Peace efforts are complicated because there are private economic interests in Kenya that benefit directly from conflict in the Sudans, in the DRC, which is now the most deadly conflict in the world since World War II. Current estimates are 10 million conflict-related deaths over the past decade. Peace efforts are similarly hindered because of Ugandan and Rwandan commercial interests. And yet, within the AU ideology of solidarity, which, by the way, is a beautiful thing, we may all the same be creating blind spots with respect to the realities of the political economy of conflict. The third point that I would make is that the AU's international partners in the UN and elsewhere are also driven by private sector interests. 10 years ago, the EU's pressure on Rwanda helped to moderate the conflict in the DRC. But today, Rwandan troops are protecting European commercial gas interests in Mozambique, and EU pressure on the players in the Great Lakes and in the DRC has been much less forthcoming, and I don't think those are unrelated. And here, I think we need to recognize, in a world where the UK has merged the aid and trade offices, and I'm an American, my government has publicly announced last week in Abidjan that the primary role of a US ambassador in Africa is to make deals good for US businesses. In this changing international landscape, we in Africa will need to be even more wary of international entanglements in peace-building efforts. Those are, to my mind, less and less likely to be driven by human rights and human security, and more likely to be driven by naked commercial interests. So in very brief, because I would love to get to comments from the other people who are part of this gathering, to be more effective, AU mediation will need to be more attentive to the private sector interests implicated, and thus manifesting in coalitions for or against mediated conflict resolution. To be more effective, AU mediation will need to be more attentive to the private sector that emerges from peace agreements. Are we actually doing the hard work of bringing in civil society, marginalized economic voices to help construct the deal for how we move forward? And to do either of those things, all of us who support AU aspirations for human rights and human security, we're going to need a pragmatic, clear-eyed focus on the economic interests at stake so that we can be more critical voices in this conversation about how AU mechanisms evolve. And I'll press the pause button there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that insightful presentation. I think now we've gotten to the point for the Q&A, where we're going to open the floor from the audience. Dr. Helen?
Thank you, moderator. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Good. Thank you, moderator. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me use this opportunity to say a big thank you to all our panelists for the great intervention. From my end, I think the intervention have been very clear, direct, and well articulated. Hence, I will not summarize them, but I will open to the floor directly for questions or comments. Please, for any question or intervention, kindly raise your hand or use our chat box and I will recognize you. However, to enable our panelists' response to the questions, we will take all the questions first, then allow any quick response from our speakers. Having said that, the floor is open for questions.
We do have one question from Onkopote.
Okay. Okopote?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the chair, to all three speakers. This has been a very insightful engagement. So as we reflect on the AU's evolving role in mediation, I'd like to pose a few questions, if I may be allowed, directly to the institutional challenges and opportunities facing African-led peace processes today. The first one is, given the increasing role of foreign influence, as highlighted by Dr. Shilao about the case of DRC and Rwanda, flying all the way to Qatar to find a solution that's within the continent. How can African institutions safeguard continental autonomy and ensure that peace processes are truly African-led and sustainable, which ties us back to the issue of African solutions for African problems? The second one is, how can the African Union and regional economic communities enhance coordination and synergy in conflict mediation to prevent fragmentation and duplication of efforts, which also Dr. Shilao spoke on. And the last one is, in light of the growing trend, especially in ECOWAS, of unconstitutional changes of government in the Sahel, how can the AU recalibrate its mediation role to more effectively uphold democratic norms while also addressing something that Prof. Gensen spoke about, which is the economic drivers of instability that often undermine peace efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Okuposo, for that question. Any more questions?
Yes, so my question is directed to Prof. Ganson. I would say within the context of US interest, when you look at the DRC holding some of the world's largest reserves of critical minerals, I think US foreign policy or current trade interest has been skewed towards rare earth minerals. So my question really is about in the context of the DRC, where some of the world's largest reserve of those critical minerals essential for the US and energy security. How can the AU navigate its role without being drawn in this geopolitical tug of war between the US interest, Chinese influence, and of course the local power dynamics, and what does maybe this neutrality or meaningful neutrality look like in the context where peace building is deeply entangled with global resource competition? So yeah, that's my question to Prof. Ganson.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Takashi. Any more questions? Any more questions from our audience? Okay. I also have a question, but I think my question goes to all the speakers. My question is based on the issue of African solution to African problems. As we are speaking on the future of peacekeeping operations, how will this motto work in the future if we say African solution for African problem, meaning that the problems will be solved by Africans, but still we are looking for external support. However, how would that work in the future of peacekeeping? Lastly, when we talk of African solution, at which level are we talking about? Is it at the level of member states, BRICS, AU, or UN partners? Thank you. Any more questions or intervention or comment? Okay, with this, I will pass over to the panelists to reflect on the questions raised. I will start with Prof. Gasson. Prof, over to you.
Oh my goodness, back to me already. I was hoping to get a little pause, but okay. I think so just three reflections from the questions, and apologies if I don't answer them directly, but hopefully my colleagues will come in and round out the answers. One is that I think it is helpful to understand the ecosystem within which the AU works, right? Because we heard frustration in the speakers and in the questions about limitations on the gap between the principles and the practice. But that tells us that, or reminds us that the AU is a state-run, state-led institution. It cannot work outside of the mandate allowed to it by its members. So we need to be always thinking about, okay, what is enabling or constraining the member states themselves? What is enabling and constraining civil society voices in questioning and bringing to light important issues. It is simply, simply recognizing that political will is a challenge doesn't help, because that won't change. We have to ask ourselves, okay, what are the drivers of political will? What are the levers on political will? And work on those. A lot of the issues we're talking about are not going to be fixed by simply an inward focus to the AU. I think we're going to increasingly need to look outward to whether there is downward accountability from our political leaders to our people more generally. And that means that our main tool for those of us who really want to see transformational change is probably not political as much as it is social movement, right? How do we connect with each other as residents of Africa to make sure our voices are heard more clearly in ways that influence the political conversation. I think that means to the question of at what level, when we ask that question, we're often caught in a state-based framework still. We're saying, oh, should it be national? Should it be regional? Should it be AU? Should it be UN? But those are all just other state-based mechanisms. And I think we're going to need to broaden our thinking to say, how do we break out of that uniquely state-based paradigm and say, how do we get other constructive voices into the conversation? And often that means by insisting as academics, as civil society, as faith-based organizations, not being afraid to enter these conversations, to say the things that politicians may have trouble saying, particularly through diplomatic challenges, get the evidence and the issues out there, make sure that we are emphasizing the values that we probably all on this call agree on. But we're talking social movements, political movements, not necessarily staying stuck within the political mechanisms of the formal AU system. The other, we often talk about fragmentation of efforts, and there's a part of me that says we need multiple efforts. We need lots of people working within their respective domains where they have courage and capacity when we're dealing with issues as big as conflict and peace. I think the bigger issue is, are those adding up? Do we have coherence and cumulative impact of our variety of efforts? And there, I think we do need some thinking about how we make some of these efforts a bit more open source. How can we bring the issues, the processes more into the open, where they can influence more actors to act in coherent ways, so that, for example, we don't have the economic planning happening in opposition to what we know about the root causes of the conflict in the first place. Multiplicity of effort doesn't worry me as much as incoherence of effort, which I think has been demonstrated over the past decades. To address that, I think we're going to have to change the culture of diplomacy from something very private and privileged and, we send our biggest women and men out there and say, no, we need to democratize the diplomatic process a bit more so that we can all be rowing the boat in roughly the same direction. I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof, for that great intervention. I will bring on board Dr. Weston to address the first question posed by Uncle Potso on the DRC Rwanda case at Qatar. How can African institutions safeguard continental autonomy and ensure that peace processes are truly African-led and sustainable? Over to you, Dr. Weston.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'll proceed from the premise that the all is as good as its sum. And therefore, the weaknesses that the AU betrays, or the weaknesses that IGAD, Intergovernmental Authority on Development, within the East African region, or ECOWAS, or the East African Community, are usually spill over from individual member states. So you're not going to have a strong regional body, strong enough to spearhead mediation processes within its domain, or you're not going to have a strong AU to lead in mediation processes on the continent when individual member states are weak, are divided, they have got weak economies, and they're grappling with, politics based on, divisive, tribal, ethnic, or cultural considerations. And therefore, why Qatar will step in and very fast, host Kagame and Tshisekedi, or the one when the regional body is struggling, or the AU is struggling. It has a lot to do with the gravitas that Qatar brings on Congo, Rwanda, struggle, to listen to Kenya, listen to Tanzania, listen to Uganda, because those countries within the area are also complicit, as Professor put it, for very parochial interests. And therefore, it's a case of lack of, moral gravitas, lack of the requisite impartiality. And therefore, that's why we often find external actors swinging into action, sometimes even without regard for, local processes that may be ongoing. So it's a question of, the structural challenges that individual member states in those respective regions and within the AU umbrella face. And therefore, this autonomy will not come magically. It will be a question of going back to the basics, that efforts must be put in place, both locally and, of course, internationally, to ensure that these countries have got strong institutions and they move away from personality cults. It's not easy. I have no illusions at all that that is easy. And strong institution within member states will make it possible for ECOWAS, for IGAD, for the East African Community, or SADC, to take charge of conflicts within their respective areas. And of course, lack of meddling in neighboring countries' internal affairs, which completely eviscerates the impartiality required. The other thing was about duplication of efforts, REC and AU. Well, in principle, it's about the principle of subsidiarity. AU, I think, operates under that model, that we are distant from the conflict, and therefore we will listen to SADC to tell us about the problem in Zimbabwe. We listen to ECOWAS to tell us what the problem is like in Ivory Coast or Burkina Faso when they were part of the ECOWAS, and they will lead in that regard. Therefore, sometimes because of interests, both domestically and of course externally, this principle is not always implemented or adhered to. Hence, the propensity to read from different scripts. And that makes it, the whole process of realizing peace very protracted. And sometimes it's completely torpedoed out of the way. So again, it calls for trust. It calls for commitment. And it calls for, African countries and leaders not to engage while hiding some lethal cards under the table, as we can see with the Congolese crisis. The last question was about ECOWAS and the unconstitutional change of government in that region, democratic norms. I think the coups that happened within the Sahel region are inviting, and I'm listening to a whole host of conversations across the continent. Conversations around democracy. What exactly does it entail? Is it just enough to have a government in place that supposedly came into office courtesy of democracy, when that government clearly demonstrates inability, to fulfill its core mandates? That's the question. And one of the questions that, observers and keen observers are grappling with in these regions. Hence the groundswell of support whenever those army men came into power. A question of, do we have puppet governments that are fulfilling external ends and interests, or are governments really committed to fulfilling the needs and aspirations of their people? So it's one thing to uphold unconstitutional change of government, but it's another thing to ensure that governments that are in place are actually not just a reflection of the people, not just about democracy and electoralism, but they also perform optimally in fulfilling the core mandate, the interests of the people, public goods, and help in addressing issues of poverty, of inequalities, of unemployment among its youth. So it's not just enough to say the military junta has contravened the AU Constitutive Act on unconstitutional change of government. It's about also the substance, the quality of governance vis-a-vis the regime in place. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Weston, for that great intervention. Since we are running out of time, I'm going to bring Dr. Annie Kelechi on board to address the other issues. Thank you, Dr. Annie.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Helen. I will address your last question, where you talked about the idea of African solution to African problems, and then the quest for external support. At which level do we talk of African solution? The truth remains that the idea of African solutions to African problems is not practically sustainable now, except in African problems that the geospatial influence is purely African. What do I mean by that? Conflict and insecurity are only limited to Africa, and local domestic interests can be managed through Afrocentricity and governance transformation. But, Prof, have shown, and Doc, the second speaker, that many of these countries are serious resource-based countries that are driven by Western influence. I also don't agree with Prof that democratization of the diplomatic process will solve some of this problem, because the hegemonic influence of the West will destroy politics of diplomacy, undermine Africa. When I love his multi-track analogy, I believe that is practical. I also joined up in saying that we must condemn tribalism and ethnic politics. We must promote strong national economies, promote private interventions that are economic driven to build strong economy in Africa. If not, Africans will continue to go to UAE, to Qatar, to other countries to solve their problems. Finally, I advocate multi-track mediation and peace building in all our conflicts and this is because we do not have the sustainable government and institutional structures, both at national government and at regional government and management, because those projects, foreign multinational companies and foreign businesses are not living. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Annie, for that great intervention. If there's any more question, our audience are welcome to post them, or they can raise their hand so our host can unmute them.
All right. Dr. Helen, because
Yes.
of time, I think because of time, I think I can give the closing remarks. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us to this critical session. I think we've had a rich discussion, and we had a lot of insights from our speakers that have deepened our understanding of the promise, of course, and the limitations thereof of African Union's mediation efforts. And I think Dr. Annie, you rightfully emphasized both the ambition behind, APSA, as well as the real world constraints in asserting that credible leadership, as well as the shifting conflict dynamics. And Dr. Weston, also, you rightfully pointed out opportunities to reform, as well as more effective partnerships, particularly with regional economic communities, principal subsidiarity and complementarity. And Prof. Ganson, you reminded us, of course, that mediation does not happen in a vacuum. I think these ecosystems are important, and the AU, of course, must navigate not only for these political complexities, but I think the influence of these private geopolitical actors whose interests may run counter to peace, I think I could argue. But essentially, I think all these presentations, they underscored the need to rethink how the AU operationalizes mediation, but with more agility to an extent, and inclusivity, and more realistic grasp of the political economies of conflict, essentially. And I think, of course, for emphasis, then the launch, this session marks the launch of our broader peace and security dialogue series, where we will continue to interrogate some of these issues in depth and work towards more grounded and actionable policy conversations. So on behalf of SACHI, African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy at UJ, I want to extend our sincere thanks to Dr. Annie, Dr. Weston, and Prof. Ganson for your contributions and to all the questions, insights, and engagements. And I'll say we look forward to seeing you for our future sessions. I think until then, stay safe and continue the conversation. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.